We're learning that Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a phone call with Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, expressed solidarity with the Venezuelan people. Some Democratic lawmakers are expressing concern. Senator Rand Paul saying it sounds a lot like the beginning of a war.
I have spent over 3 decades studying how great powers lose influence in their own spheres of dominance, and I can tell you that the clearest sign is not military defeat or economic collapse. It is when other powers can operate freely in your backyard while you watch helplessly from the sidelines. That moment arrived this week when Russian President Vladimir Putin picked up the phone and called Nicolas Maduro to reaffirm Moscow's support for Venezuela in the face of what the Kremlin openly described as mounting external pressure from the United States. Think about what that phone call represents. The leader of Russia, a country we spent the last 2 decades trying to contain and isolate, is now providing diplomatic cover, economic support, and strategic partnership to a government in our own hemisphere that we have tried everything short of military invasion to remove. And he is doing it openly, confidently, without any concern about American reaction. That is not Russian aggression. That is American irrelevance. Let me be very precise about what happened, because the details expose just how much Washington's Venezuela policy has failed. On December 11, 2025, Putin and Maduro held a phone conversation in which the Russian president expressed solidarity with the Venezuelan people and confirmed support for Maduro's government in protecting national interests and sovereignty amid what Moscow described as growing external pressures. The Kremlin statement was not subtle. It explicitly framed Russia as Venezuela's protector against American threats. The two leaders discussed furthering their strategic partnership agreement that came into force in November 2025, and they committed to implementing joint projects in trade, economics, energy, finance, and cultural exchanges. This was not a routine diplomatic call. This was Russia publicly staking its claim to Venezuela as a sphere of influence while the United States deploys aircraft carriers to the Caribbean, and President Trump declares that Maduro's days are numbered. Now you might ask why a phone call matters so much. After all, Putin and Maduro have spoken many times before, but context is everything in international relations. This call came at the exact moment when the United States has escalated pressure to levels not seen in years. We have deployed thousands of troops and an aircraft carrier strike group to the Caribbean. Trump has issued repeated threats stating that Maduro will be removed. We have tightened sanctions even further. We have frozen tens of billions in Venezuelan assets. We have essentially declared that regime change is inevitable and imminent. And Putin's response to all of this overwhelming American pressure was to pick up the phone and tell Maduro, in language the whole world could hear, that Russia has his back. That is not just diplomatic support. That is a direct challenge to American power in the Western Hemisphere. And the most alarming part is that Putin knows we cannot do anything about it. This is what I have been warning about for years in my writing and on my program. When you pursue regime change policies without success, when you apply maximum pressure without achieving your objectives, you do not just fail to remove the government you oppose. You advertise your impotence to every other power watching. We told the world that Maduro would fall. We imposed the harshest sanctions outside North Korea. We recognized an opposition leader as the legitimate president. We placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. We seized Citgo and froze billions in Venezuelan assets. We organized international coalitions to isolate Caracas diplomatically. And after all of that, after years of maximum pressure and absolute certainty that we would succeed, Maduro is still there. And now he has Putin on speed dial offering partnership while we deploy carriers that everyone knows we will not actually use for invasion. The strategic consequences of this failure extend far beyond Venezuela. Every country in the global south watching this situation is learning a lesson that will shape international relations for the next generation. They are learning that if you can survive American pressure for long enough, alternative partners will emerge to support you. They are learning that Russia and China will provide economic lifelines, diplomatic cover, and strategic partnership without demanding regime change or political transformation. They are learning that the multipolar world I described in my book, The Post-American World, is not a distant future. It is the present reality. And most damaging of all, they are learning that American threats are increasingly hollow, that our sanctions can be circumvented, and that our regime change efforts can be resisted. This is the cost of policy driven by fear rather than strategy. We feared that a socialist government in Venezuela would spread leftist influence across Latin America and threaten American economic interests in the region. So we tried to strangle the Venezuelan economy and topple its government. But we never asked the fundamental strategic question: what happens if we fail? What is our plan if maximum pressure does not produce regime change? The answer, it turns out, is that we have no plan. We just keep applying pressure, issuing threats, and watching as Russia and China fill the vacuum we created. This is not strategy. This is hope disguised as policy. And in international relations, hope is not a strategy. Now I need to address the argument I know many are thinking. Venezuela under Maduro has experienced catastrophic economic collapse, massive human rights violations, and the exodus of nearly 7 million refugees. These are serious governance failures that deserve condemnation. Maduro has systematically dismantled democratic institutions, manipulated elections, jailed opposition leaders, and used security forces against civilians. By every measure, Venezuela is what I identified in 1997 as an illiberal democracy, a government that maintains electoral rituals while destroying the checks and balances that make democracy meaningful. So surely, the argument goes, we are right to oppose such a government even if our methods have not succeeded. But this misses the entire point of what foreign policy is supposed to accomplish. Foreign policy is not about moral satisfaction. It is about advancing national interests through effective strategy, and our Venezuela policy has failed spectacularly on both counts. Let me explain why this matters so much. When we decided that Maduro was unacceptable and must be removed, we committed ourselves to a binary outcome. Either he falls and we achieve our objective, or he survives and we reveal that our power has limits. There is no middle ground in regime change policy. You either succeed or you advertise failure. And in Venezuela, we have advertised failure for years while watching Russia and China move in. We could have maintained diplomatic relations and used engagement to shape Venezuelan behavior. We could have kept economic channels open to preserve leverage. We could have worked with regional partners to contain the damage while avoiding the humiliation of failed regime change. Instead, we chose maximum pressure and regime change, and now we have a Russian strategic partnership in the Caribbean, while Maduro celebrates his survival as proof that American hegemony is over. The phone call between Putin and Maduro is significant precisely because it reveals the new architecture of power in what I call the post-American world. This is not a world where America has collapsed or become irrelevant. We remain the most powerful country by most measures. But it is a world where other powers have options, where our threats can be resisted, where alternative partnerships can sustain governments we oppose. Russia does not have to be stronger than the United States to support Venezuela. They just have to be present, engaged, and willing to offer what we refuse to provide: partnership without regime change demands. China does not have to replace American economic dominance to give Venezuela survival options. They just have to offer loans, investment, and trade on terms that do not require political transformation. Together, Russia and China have created what amounts to a shield against American pressure that did not exist 20 years ago. And here is what American policymakers still refuse to understand. This is not happening because Russia and China are more powerful than the United States. It is happening because we created the conditions for it through our own policy choices. When we froze Venezuelan assets, we forced them to find alternative financial systems. When we sanctioned their oil exports, we pushed them toward Russian and Chinese energy partnerships. When we tried to overthrow their government, we gave them no choice but to seek security guarantees from our adversaries. Every single step of our maximum pressure campaign had a predictable consequence that we ignored because we assumed our power was so overwhelming that consequences did not matter. We were wrong. And now we are paying the price for that arrogance. Bloco 2. 1,700 to 1,800 palavras. What makes Putin's phone call particularly significant is not just what was said, but what it represents about the changing structure of international order. According to the Kremlin statement, Putin and Maduro discussed implementing their strategic partnership agreement that came into force just last month, in November 2025. This is not some vague memorandum of understanding. This is a formalized treaty that commits Russia to long-term economic, military, and diplomatic support for Venezuela. The two leaders specifically mentioned joint projects in trade, energy, and finance. Russia has already rebuilt much of Venezuela's collapsed oil infrastructure. They operate military facilities on Venezuelan soil. They provide intelligence sharing and cybersecurity support. They have restructured Venezuelan debt and provided credit lines when Western financial institutions cut Caracas off completely. This is not symbolic partnership. This is deep strategic integration happening in America's hemisphere, while we deploy aircraft carriers and issue threats that everyone knows we will not follow through on. The timing of the call is equally important. It came just days after Trump's latest declaration that Maduro's days are numbered, and amid the largest U.S. military deployment to the Caribbean in recent years. Putin could have remained quiet and let events play out. Instead, he He chose to publicly reaffirm support at the exact moment of maximum American pressure. That is a calculated signal not just to Maduro, but to every country watching. The message is clear. If you can withstand initial American pressure, Russia will provide support that allows you to survive indefinitely. This is the same playbook Russia used with Syria. When the United States declared that Assad must go, Russia stepped in with military support and diplomatic cover. Assad is still there. And now Putin is applying that model to Venezuela, proving that it works not just in the Middle East, but in Latin America as well. Now, some American analysts argue that Russian support for Venezuela is unsustainable, that Russia lacks the economic resources to prop up a failing state long-term, and that eventually Venezuela will collapse regardless of Moscow's backing. This analysis fundamentally misunderstands how power works in a multipolar system. Russia does not need to rebuild the Venezuelan economy or create sustainable prosperity. They just need to prevent collapse long enough to maintain their strategic foothold and demonstrate that American regime change efforts can be blocked. And they are succeeding at this limited objective. Venezuela's economy remains catastrophic, but the government remains stable. Maduro remains in power. Russian influence remains entrenched. From Moscow's perspective, that is a strategic victory achieved at relatively low cost. China's role in this dynamic is equally important and often overlooked in American discourse. While Russia provides military and diplomatic support, China provides economic survival mechanisms. China holds the majority of Venezuelan sovereign debt, estimated at over $60 billion. They have secured long-term oil supply contracts at favorable prices. They have built critical infrastructure including ports, telecommunications networks, and power systems. Most importantly, they offer an alternative financial system that allows Venezuela to conduct international trade despite American sanctions. When the United States cuts countries off from dollar-denominated transactions and Western financial institutions, China offers yuan-denominated trade, credit lines through Chinese banks, and participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not charity. This is strategic investment that gives China access to Venezuela's vast natural resources while simultaneously eroding American financial hegemony. What we are witnessing is the practical construction of what I have called the post-American world. This is not a world where America has lost all influence or become a second-rate power. It is a world where American dominance is no longer absolute, where other powers can create alternative systems, and where countries have options they did not have before. For decades, if you were a developing country that needed loans, you went to the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, which meant accepting American-designed structural adjustment programs. If you needed to trade commodities, you used dollar-denominated contracts. If you faced a security threat, you sought American protection. That monopoly is over. Today, if the IMF refuses loans, you can go to Chinese development banks. If Western sanctions cut you off from dollar markets, you can trade in yuan or rubles. If America threatens regime change, you can seek Russian military support. Venezuela is not unique. It is a test case for a model that is being replicated across the developing world. The question American policymakers should be asking is not how to increase pressure on Venezuela, but why our pressure keeps failing, and what that failure reveals about changing global power dynamics. The honest answer is uncomfortable. Our Venezuela policy is failing because the structure of international power has changed in ways we refuse to acknowledge. We still operate with a hegemonic mindset that assumes American preferences will eventually prevail through economic coercion and diplomatic isolation. But in a multipolar world with alternative power centers, coercion without engagement just drives countries toward our competitors. This is not a Venezuela problem. This is a structural problem that affects how we engage with any country that refuses to accept American terms. I have argued for years that American foreign policy needs fundamental recalibration to succeed in the 21st century, and the Venezuela crisis exposes exactly why. First, we must abandon regime change as a primary foreign policy tool. It has failed catastrophically in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and now Venezuela. Even when regime change succeeds militarily, it creates instability worse than the original problem. The attempt to overthrow Maduro has failed while pushing Venezuela into a permanent alliance with Russia and China. At what point do we acknowledge that the policy is not working and try something different? Second, we need to accept that engagement does not mean approval. We can maintain diplomatic relations, preserve economic channels, and keep communication open with governments we oppose. This gives us leverage to shape behavior and compete with Russian and Chinese influence. When we sever all contact and apply maximum pressure, we eliminate our own leverage while advertising our impotence when that pressure fails. India maintains relations with Russia while deepening partnership with the United States. Turkey hosts Russian tourists while remaining in NATO. These countries understand that in a multipolar world, you maintain relationships with multiple powers. We need to extend the same flexibility to Latin American countries instead of demanding exclusive alignment. Third, we must compete on substance rather than sanctions. Russia and China are gaining influence by showing up with investment, infrastructure, and partnership. We keep showing up with conditions, criticism, and threats. The Belt and Road Initiative is not succeeding because Chinese projects are superior to American alternatives. It is succeeding because China is offering financing and construction, while we are offering lectures about governance and demands for political reform. We have the resources to compete. What we lack is the strategic vision to deploy those resources effectively without ideological conditions that recipients find unacceptable. Fourth, we desperately need policy consistency. American foreign policy changes dramatically every 4 to 8 years depending on which party controls the presidency. This unpredictability makes long-term strategic planning impossible for potential partners. When countries negotiate with Russia or China, they know those agreements will outlast leadership transitions. When they negotiate with the United States, they know everything could be reversed after the next election. This structural inconsistency is a self-imposed handicap that we could fix if we had the political will to establish bipartisan foreign policy frameworks. The cost of failing to adapt is visible in Venezuela right now. Putin's phone call was not an aggressive move. It was a response to opportunity created by American policy failure. We created a vacuum through sanctions and regime change attempts, and Russia filled that vacuum because we left the door open. Every country in Latin America, Africa, and Asia watching this situation is learning that alignment with the United States comes with massive risks and uncertain benefits, while partnership with Russia and China comes with fewer demands and more predictable support. That is not a propaganda victory for our adversaries. That is a strategic reality we created through our own choices. Venezuela is not lost because Maduro is a dictator or because the Venezuelan people chose Russia over America. Venezuela is lost because we pursued a policy based on fear and ideological rigidity rather than strategic thinking and flexible engagement. We assumed that American power was so overwhelming that we could simply coerce compliance. We were wrong. And the price of that miscalculation is visible every time Putin picks up the phone to reassure Maduro that Russia will support Venezuelan sovereignty against American pressure. That phone call is not evidence of Russian strength. It is evidence of American weakness. And until we recognize that reality and adapt our approach, we will keep watching as our adversaries gain influence in regions we once took for granted. The post-American world does not mean American decline is inevitable. It means American adaptation is necessary. We remain the most powerful country in the world by most measures. But power without effective strategy is just wasted potential. Venezuela is a test case for whether we can learn to operate effectively in a multipolar environment. So far, we are failing that test. The question is whether we will recognize the failure and adjust, or whether we will keep repeating the same mistakes while wondering why countries keep choosing our competitors. Putin's phone call this week should be a wake-up call. The question is whether anyone in Washington is listening. If this analysis made you rethink American foreign policy and our role in the changing global order, subscribe to this channel. We need informed citizens who understand how power actually works in the 21st century. Thank you for watching.